Richard Barry Randolph was a military veteran who had served his country with honor, receiving an honorable discharge from the Army. He seemed like an ordinary man trying to make his way in civilian life, working at a Handyway convenience store in East Palatka, Florida. But on August 15, 1988, Randolph would commit a crime so brutal, so relentlessly violent, that it would shock even hardened homicide investigators, and ultimately land him on Florida's death row for over 3 decades. This is the shocking true story of how a former soldier became a savage killer, and how his victim's incredible will to survive revealed just how determined he was to end her life. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because this case will show you that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it works beside you, serves you coffee, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. Born in 1962, Richard Barry Randolph grew up in Florida during a time of social change and economic uncertainty. Details about his early childhood are sparse, but what is known is that he eventually joined the United States Army, where he served his country and received an honorable discharge. For many young men of his generation, military service provided structure, discipline, and a sense of purpose. For Randolph, it apparently provided none of these things in any lasting way. After leaving the military, Randolph drifted through various jobs, struggling to find stable employment or build meaningful relationships. He eventually found work at a Handyway convenience store in East Palatka, a small town in Putnam County, Florida. The job was simple, low-paying work: stocking shelves, running the register, dealing with customers during long shifts. It was the kind of job that many people use as a stepping stone to something better. But for Randolph, it became something else entirely: an opportunity to study the store's operations, its security weaknesses, and its patterns of activity. Randolph worked at the Handyway for a period of time before eventually leaving or being terminated from his position. The exact circumstances of his departure from the job aren't entirely clear, but what is clear is that his time working at the store gave him intimate knowledge of its layout, its cash handling procedures, and most importantly, its vulnerabilities. This knowledge would prove crucial when he decided to return to the store with criminal intent. Minnie Ruth McCollum was 47 years old in August 1988, a hard-working woman who had taken a job at the Handyway convenience store to support herself. She was the kind of employee that every business values: reliable, honest, and dedicated to doing her job well. On the night of August 15, 1988, she was working alone at the store, managing the register, stocking items, and serving the occasional customer who stopped in during the late evening hours. What Minnie didn't know was that her former colleague, Richard Barry Randolph, had been planning to rob the store where they had both worked. He knew the layout, he knew the routines, and most importantly, he knew when the store would be most vulnerable. That night, he put his plan into action, arriving at the Handyway with the intention of stealing money or lottery tickets, a quick score that he apparently believed would be easy, given his familiarity with the store's operations. But Randolph hadn't counted on Minnie Ruth McCollum. When she interrupted him in the process of stealing from the store, his plan for a simple theft transformed into something far more sinister and violent. What happened next would reveal the true depths of Randolph's capacity for brutality and his complete disregard for human life. The attack on Minnie Ruth McCollum was not a sudden explosion of violence, a momentary loss of control, or a panicked reaction to being discovered. It was sustained, repeated, and relentless, a systematic attempt to end her life that played out over an extended period as Randolph returned to her again and again, frustrated by her refusal to die quickly. According to court records and medical evidence presented at trial, Randolph brutally beat Minnie about the head with his hands and fists, inflicting severe trauma to her skull and brain. But beating her wasn't enough. He kicked her repeatedly, adding blunt force trauma to various parts of her body. When she still showed signs of life, he strangled her with a ligature, attempting to cut off her oxygen and finish what the beating had started. And when that still didn't kill her quickly enough, he stabbed her with a knife, inflicting wounds that would ultimately prove fatal. The most chilling aspect of the attack, however, was revealed in Randolph's own statements to investigators after his arrest. He admitted that he went back to Minnie on 4 or 5 separate occasions while trying to murder her. Each time he thought he had finished the job, Each time he prepared to leave the scene, she would show some sign of life, a movement, a breath, a sound that told him she was still alive. His own words reflected his frustration with her incredible will to survive. She was much tougher than he thought, and he had to repeat the beatings and strangulations multiple times. This revelation is particularly horrifying because it demonstrates that Randolph's violence was not a crime of passion or a momentary loss of control. It was calculated, persistent, and showed a level of determination to end Minnie's life that went far beyond what would have been necessary to simply escape the scene. He could have fled after the initial attack. He could have left her injured but alive and made his escape while she was incapacitated. Instead, he chose to return to her again and again, ensuring that she would not survive to identify him. The sexual assault that Randolph committed against Minnie during this prolonged attack added another layer of depravity to his crimes. This was not simply a robbery gone wrong or even a murder committed to eliminate a witness. It was an opportunity that Randolph took to satisfy his darkest urges, while his victim lay helpless and dying. After finally believing that Minnie was dead or dying, Randolph took her car and drove away from the scene. But even in his escape, he showed remarkable callousness and stupidity. He drove to other locations where he cashed the stolen lottery tickets he had taken from the handiway, creating a clear trail of evidence that would eventually lead investigators directly to him. His belief that Minnie would not survive to identify him, combined with his arrogant assumption that he had committed the perfect crime, led him to behave as if he had nothing to fear from law enforcement. But Minnie Ruth McCollum was not dead. Despite the savage, repeated assaults that Randolph had inflicted upon her, despite being beaten, strangled, stabbed, and sexually assaulted, she was still alive when help arrived. Emergency responders found her at the scene and rushed her to the hospital, where doctors discovered the full extent of her injuries. She had suffered severe brain injuries from the repeated blows to her head, damage that had left her in a coma from which she would never awaken. For 6 days, Minnie Ruth McCollum clung to life in that hospital bed, her body fighting to survive even as the damage to her brain made recovery impossible. On August 21, 1988, 6 days after Randolph's brutal attack, Minnie finally succumbed to her injuries and passed away. Her death elevated Randolph's crimes from attempted murder and robbery to first-degree murder, and it set in motion a legal process that would ultimately result in his placement on death row. In imposing the death sentence, the trial judge found that the aggravating circumstances, including the heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the murder, its commission during the course of a sexual battery and robbery, and Randolph's calculated, repeated attempts to kill his victim, far outweighed any mitigating factors. The judge concluded that death was the appropriate sentence for Richard Barry Randolph's crimes, and he was formally sentenced to death in 1989. Randolph's case went through the automatic appeals process that accompanies every death sentence in Florida. In 1990, the Florida Supreme Court reviewed his conviction and sentence, examining every aspect of the trial and the evidence presented. The court found no reversible error and unanimously affirmed both his conviction and his sentence of death. This affirmation by the state's highest court eliminated Randolph's most immediate avenue for overturning his sentence. But as with all death penalty cases, Randolph's legal team continued to file appeals and motions for decades, challenging various aspects of his trial, his sentence, and the constitutionality of the death penalty itself. These appeals delayed his execution for over 30 years, during which time he lived on death row at Florida State Prison, one of hundreds of condemned inmates awaiting their fate. During his decades on death row, Randolph maintained a relatively low profile. Unlike some death row inmates who become vocal advocates for their own innocence or who grant extensive interviews to journalists and researchers, Randolph largely remained out of the public eye. Prison officials described him as a generally compliant inmate who followed the rules and caused relatively few problems, though this behavior did nothing to change the fundamental nature of his crime or the appropriateness of his sentence. The years passed slowly for Randolph on death row, as they do for all condemned inmates. He watched as other prisoners were executed, as legal challenges to the death penalty succeeded and failed, and as Florida's execution protocols changed and evolved. Through it all, his own execution date remained uncertain. delayed by ongoing appeals and the lengthy process of capital punishment in the American legal system. Meanwhile, the family and friends of Minnie Ruth McCollum lived with the permanent absence created by Randolph's violence. For them, the decades of legal appeals represented a prolonged denial of justice, a system that seemed to prioritize the rights of the murderer over the memory and dignity of his victim. Each appeal, each delay, each legal maneuver by Randolph's attorneys reopened wounds that had never fully healed and reminded them that their loved one's killer was still alive while Minnie had been dead for decades. The small community of East Palatka, where the Handyway convenience store had stood and where Minnie had worked and died, gradually moved on from the immediate trauma of her murder. The store eventually closed or changed ownership, new businesses opened in its place, and younger residents grew up knowing nothing about the brutal crime that had occurred there in 1988. But for those who had known Minnie, who had worked with her or been served by her at the store, the memory of her kindness and the horror of her death remained fresh even as the years turned into decades. The case also served as a grim reminder of the vulnerability of convenience store workers, who often work alone during late-night hours and face regular risks from robberies and violent crime. Minnie's death highlighted the dangers inherent in these jobs and the need for better security measures and protections for workers in high-risk retail environments. As Florida's pace of executions accelerated dramatically in recent years, Randolph's case gradually moved toward its conclusion. The state had been executing death row inmates at an unprecedented rate, with multiple executions scheduled throughout 2025. This acceleration was driven by various factors, including changes in state leadership, evolving legal standards, and a political climate that favored the swift implementation of death sentences. In October 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Richard Barry Randolph's death warrant, scheduling his execution for November 20, 2025, at 6 p.m. at Florida State Prison near Starka. The news brought mixed emotions to those who had been affected by his crime. For Minnie's family and friends, it represented the long-delayed fulfillment of justice, a final accounting for the brutal murder that had taken her from them more than 3 decades earlier. For opponents of the death penalty, it represented another execution in what had become a record-breaking year for capital punishment in Florida. Randolph's attorneys immediately began filing final appeals, challenging various aspects of his conviction, sentence, and the constitutionality of his scheduled execution. These appeals were expected to go to both the Florida Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court, representing Randolph's last opportunities to avoid execution. However, given that both courts had previously reviewed and affirmed his conviction and sentence, legal observers considered it unlikely that these final appeals would succeed. As November 20, 2025 approached, preparations began at Florida State Prison for what would be, if carried out, the state's 17th execution of the year, a grim record that more than doubled Florida's previous annual high of 8 executions. Prison officials coordinated with media representatives who would witness the execution, family members of the victim who wished to be present, and the small number of Randolph supporters who had requested to attend. The psychological profile of Richard Barry Randolph presents a disturbing case study in sudden, explosive violence. Unlike serial killers who plan their crimes meticulously over extended periods, Randolph's brutal murder of Minnie Ruth McCollum appears to have been triggered by his decision to commit robbery and his rage at being interrupted in the act. However, the sustained and repeated nature of his attack, returning to her 4 or 5 times because she refused to die, suggests a capacity for violence that went far beyond what would have been necessary to simply escape the scene. What makes Randolph's case particularly chilling is the contrast between his honorable military service and the savage brutality he displayed during the attack on Minnie. His time in the Army should have instilled discipline, respect for others, and an understanding of the sanctity of life. Instead, when confronted with the prospect of being caught during a robbery, he unleashed a level of violence that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. The fact that Randolph returned to Minnie multiple times, frustrated by her will to survive, reveals something particularly dark about his psychology. Most criminals who kill to avoid identification would strike once and flee, hoping that the initial attack would be sufficient.
Randolph's repeated returns to ensure her death demonstrated a determination and persistence in violence that suggested deeper psychological issues than simple panic or fear of consequences. His decision to sexually assault Minnie during or after the attack adds another dimension to understanding his psychology. This was not simply about eliminating a witness or escaping after a robbery gone wrong. It was about taking advantage of a helpless victim to satisfy his own depraved urges, demonstrating a complete lack of empathy or recognition of Minnie's humanity.
The impact of Randolph's crime extended far beyond Minnie Ruth McCollum herself to encompass her family, her friends, her co-workers, and the entire community of East Palatka. Her brutal murder shattered assumptions about safety and security in their small town, creating fear and suspicion where there had previously been trust and openness. For the convenience store industry and retail workers generally, Minnie's death highlighted the ongoing dangers faced by employees who work alone during late-night hours. Her murder became another tragic example in a long list of retail workers who have been killed by robbers, demonstrating the need for better security measures, staffing practices, and protections for those in high-risk positions. The case also raised important questions about the death penalty and its application in Florida. Randolph's crime was undoubtedly brutal and horrific, meeting any reasonable standard for the heinous, atrocious, and cruel aggravating factor that justifies capital punishment under Florida law. The fact that 8 of 12 jurors voted for death, while 4 voted for life imprisonment, demonstrates that even in cases of extreme violence, reasonable people can disagree about the appropriate punishment. The decades-long delay between Randolph's 1989 death sentence and his scheduled 2025 execution illustrates one of the central criticisms of capital punishment as currently practiced in the United States. Opponents argue that this lengthy delay defeats the purposes of capital punishment, whether those purposes are understood as retribution, deterrence, or closure for victims' families. By the time Randolph faces execution, he will have spent 36 years on death row, longer than Minnie Ruth McCollum lived before he killed her. Supporters of the death penalty argue that these delays are the result of excessive appeals and legal maneuvering by defense attorneys, and that streamlining the appeals process would address this concern. However, the complexity of capital cases and the need to ensure that innocent people are not executed require careful review of every death sentence, making some degree of delay inevitable. The acceleration of Florida's execution pace in 2025, with Randolph's scheduled execution representing the 17th of the year, reflects changing political attitudes toward capital punishment in the state. This dramatic increase from previous years suggests a deliberate effort by state officials to carry out death sentences more quickly and reduce the backlog of condemned inmates awaiting execution. For those who believe in the death penalty as an appropriate punishment for the most serious crimes, Randolph's case represents exactly the kind of situation where capital punishment is justified. His brutal, sustained attack on Minnie Ruth McCollum, combined with sexual assault and robbery, and his complete lack of remorse for his actions, make him precisely the kind of offender that death penalty statutes were designed to address. For opponents of capital punishment, Randolph's case raises different questions about the value of execution as a response to even the most brutal crimes. They argue that life imprisonment without parole would adequately protect society from Randolph while avoiding the moral complications and practical problems associated with state-sanctioned killing. Regardless of one's position on the death penalty, Richard Barry Randolph's case serves as a reminder of the real human cost of violent crime. Minnie Ruth McCollum was a hard-working woman trying to earn a living and support herself through honest labor. She deserved to work in safety, to return home to her loved ones at the end of her shift, and to live out her natural life. Instead, she encountered a former co-worker who had decided that his desire for quick money and lottery tickets was worth more than her life, her dignity, or her right to exist. The 6 days that Minnie spent in a coma before finally succumbing to her injuries represent 6 days of hope and horror for her family. Hope that she might somehow survive and recover, horror at the knowledge of what had been done to her, and the likelihood that she would never wake up. When she finally passed away on August 21, 1988, her death marked not just the end of her own life, but the beginning of decades of grief, anger, and waiting for justice for those who loved her. As this case approaches its final resolution, whether through execution or through some last-minute legal intervention, it remains a powerful reminder of the fragility of human life and the devastating consequences of a single violent encounter. Richard Barry Randolph's decision to rob the Handyway that night in 1988 and his subsequent decision to brutally murder the woman who interrupted him set in motion a chain of events that has affected countless lives and will continue to resonate long after his own life ends. The story of Richard Barry Randolph and Minnie Ruth McCollum is ultimately a tragedy without redemption, a case where no outcome can restore what was lost or heal all the wounds that were inflicted. Whether Randolph is executed as scheduled or whether some legal development delays or prevents his execution, Minnie will remain dead. Her family will continue to grieve, and the community that knew her will remember the brutal way she died at the hands of a man she had once worked alongside. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more deep dives into cases like this one. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and let me know in the comments what case you'd like me to cover next. The story of Richard Barry Randolph reminds us that evil can wear ordinary faces, and that the courage of victims like Minnie Ruth McCollum, who fought for her life even as Randolph returned again and again to finish what he had started, deserves to be remembered and honored. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember that behind every criminal case are real people whose lives were forever changed by violence.